Hello and welcome to Wessex Museums' first ever podcast series, Interrogating Hardy. This series we will be focusing on Thomas Hardy and if he is the unique hero we, or at least I, would like to think of him as. My name is Harriet Still and I am the Wessex Museums Hardy curator, as well as being the host of this podcast. This aptly named podcast series will question how far his writing did speak about multiple issues, if writing alone was enough to call him an activist, and how this can reflect our own time. Welcome to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Today we will be delving into the writer Thomas Hardy's relationship with war and martial masculinity. Hardy was absolutely obsessed by the Napoleonic Wars, and this comes through in much of his writing, even though it happened 50 years before he was born. But when he tried to reflect on the conflicts that happened in his own lifetime, he found himself walking this narrow line between being considered an armchair poet but also wanting to engage with public affairs. Was his obsession with the Napoleonic Wars normal for this period? How does he subvert the traditional portrayal of the soldier character in his novels? And does his work take a particularly new angle on conflicts? Or is he just telling us what everyone was saying already? I'm joined to explore these questions today by Dr Tracy Hayes, who has recently completed her PhD in Hardy and Masculinities, and by Nigel Amies, a freelance historical educator with an MA in English history who regularly presents sessions in schools, museums, and at public events covering social and military history from the Romans right up to the 1950s. So, without further ado, welcome to both of you. It's so lovely to be joined by you today.
Hello, thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go right back to the beginning and start with Hardy's childhood obsession with the Napoleonic era. And this is an interesting one because he lived with his grandmother growing up and she remembered Marie Antoinette being beheaded and the news reaching Wessex. And he also had a grandfather who was a volunteer on the Wessex coast, so he was based down at Weymouth. And so Hardy had this really kind of personal connection to that conflict. And even later on in life, T. Lawrence says that Hardy sees that war as the Great War. Even after the whole of the First World War's happened, he still sees that as like the Great War. And he sees the countryside as being kind of scattered with the relics of it. And I think this really kind of colours the way that he sees conflict for the rest of his life. And I was just wondering, is that kind of obsession with the Napoleonic period in the Victorian period quite normal?
I think it probably was quite an ordinary outlook in a way. After all, we beat Napoleon in 1815, and I believe people look back with rose-tinted spectacles in Victorian times. Also going forward toward the mid-19th century, you have the Crimean War in the 1850s, and after that we were almost at war with France for quite a few years. And so there's this revival in the 1860s. They're building forts down on the south coast. They built 6 over Portsmouth, Portsdown Hill, Fort Nelson being one of them. And there's a lot of paranoia about French invasion in the 1860s and 70s as well, until the Germans beat the French in the Franco-Prussian War 1871. So I think people did look back in later Victorian times towards the time of Wellington and, of course, Lord Nelson in the early part of the 19th century. What do you think, Tracy?
Oh, I agree, definitely. With the debacle of the Crimean War and all of the mistakes that were made with the government and the massive loss of life that didn't need to be, the English look back on the Napoleonic Wars as this wonderful, victorious, yay, Britain, you know, we rule the waves time. So definitely, although I would go one step further and say that for Hardy in particular, it really was an obsession. There's not many people who, on their honeymoon, make their wife traipse around the Waterloo battleground.
Well, and I think there was something about, because obviously we know that one of his novels, The Trumpet Major, is really, really grounded in historic fact of the Napoleonic era. And we've actually got his notebook, which is currently on display at Poole Museum, which shows just like these really intricate little diagrams of the uniforms being worn by soldiers and like the teapots of the period and the hairstyles of the period. And he has a book of the bugle calls of the troops. And so he really is going into the kind of nitty gritty detail of it. And I think was hearing as well that he used to go and interview the Chelsea pensioners.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he used to go and visit them most days when he was in London, to the chagrin of Emma, of course, who was waiting to do society things, and he would chuff off and go and talk to old soldiers instead.
Yeah, that's an obsession. That's a passion coming through, isn't it? There and then that level of detail, Harriet too, with teapots and the uniforms.
Yeah, it was 120 pages, that notebook. That's pretty full-on research for one novel.
Yes, indeed.
Well, and I think it's interesting at that point to think, is Trumpet Major in a weird way a kind of almost like an oral history of capturing those memories, not just the historical record kept in the British Museum library that he was researching from the notebook, but also actually collecting those memories of living people who'd experienced that conflict. Were there kind of narratives being collected at this period, Nigel?
In the 1820s, there's some personal narratives of soldiers, Rotherham Harris, also a Frenchman fighting for Napoleon, who went to Moscow in 1812 and managed to come back, be one of the few who survived. There was a bit of a trend in the 1820s and 30s for these sort of narratives to come through, even from the rank and file. There were far more from the officer classes. So yeah, there was a bit of an interest, I think, in 1820s and 30s, dimmed perhaps after the Crimean War.
So I'm afraid on this count, Hardy, you're losing out. There's other people who got there first, and you're not the first one to be writing about.
Possibly.
Okay, well, that's okay. Hardy's lost that particular point, but we'll move on to what kind of martial figures are being portrayed in the Trumpet Major. I was wondering, Tracy, with your background on masculinity in Hardy's novels, whether you could outline for us a bit those characters and how do they portray that kind of martial masculinity and fierce soldiery and all that?
The Trumpet Major, through the figure of Festus Derriman, is a complete mick-take, we have to remember. He's completely sending up martial masculinities in Festus Derriman. In fact, it's probably the most humorous novel he ever wrote, and there really is seriously laugh-out-loud bits in it. So anybody that thinks he was just miserable, he wasn't. He was hilarious when he wanted to be. But the thing is, he did do a lot of research, including into the songs, and when I was doing my PhD, I came across this piece of writing that said how responsible a yeoman soldier should be and what was expected of him. And of course, Festus completely turns this around on its head, because according to a lady called Sheila Bannerman, the Tommy, which was a generic term for enlisted soldiers since way back, it wasn't a World War I term, he was the subject of humour and deprecation, whereas the yeoman soldiery was highly respected. And Hardy turns that on its head with Festus. He says that Festus is about the size and weight of the Farnese Hercules. I wouldn't want that on my back if I was a horse, quite frankly. And he has a deep stentorian voice that speaks in tones that shook window panes. And I love this line. He's full of the conviction that simply by entering a premises, he bestows pleasure on the assembled company. And of course, what actually happens is he enters a premises and everybody runs away because he's so utterly horrible. I would say he's a womanizer, except he's so awful he can't get the women to womanize to start with. He swears loudly, he drinks a lot, and Charlotte Bannerman includes this wee song. This describes Festus rather than a Tommy. I don't want the sergeant's shilling, I don't want to be shot down. I'm really much more willing to make myself a killing, living off the pickings of the ladies of the town. And of course that's what Festus does. The second he thinks there's going to be conflict, he literally runs away. And then he comes back and says, oh, I had this thing to do. And there was this other one, while my comrades fought as comrades ought, I was nowhere to be seen. I was covered with the flag, listening to the din and strife. When the fight was o'er, out once more, and that's how I saved my life. And that's Festus Derriman. And of course the new Hardy players portray him just brilliantly. Dash my wig and all the rest of it.
It's almost like the militia and the yeomanry were used in this country to control crowds and riots. And the yeomanry were feared by the crowds. The yeomanry were particularly violent towards the crowds. Look at Peterloo, around 1817, I believe. Those were yeomanry. These are soldiers, foot soldiers, the militia, or yeomanry on horseback, who were used to control crowds and riots, and also as a counterbalance to a regular paid army, in case the army is ruled by a despot and takes over the country, as it did in Cromwell's time, and James II, for example. So the army was still feared in the mid-19th century to a certain extent, less so than earlier than the Napoleonic Wars. But the militia were notorious in yeomanry for being violent. So Festus matches that cowardly image, I think.
It really is a true subversion of everything that Hardy's contemporary reader would have been expecting. And he did it on purpose, as far as I'm concerned, because he thought martial masculinity, barring his amazing Napoleon, was pretty much a joke.
Yeah.
And I think going back to the other characters, we've then got Bob Loveday, who's a sailor, and we've got John Loveday, who's a soldier. And in that way, we're kind of almost covering like all the different camps at that point, aren't we?
Yeah, John's the actual trumpet major. He's boring, he's dependable, he's stoic. Nothing good ever happens to him. The one minute he thinks he's going to get Anne Garland, she dumps him for his brother. And of course, one of the last lines of the novel, where he dies on some unknown battlefield in Spain. And then there's his brother, who's a complete and utter cat and sleeps with anything in a skirt. And he's portrayed as being quite effeminate. He sews all his own clothes and he wears special outfits to impress important people. And Anne goes for him. That's a sucker punch.
I was wondering as well, Nigel, because the first scene he turns up, it looks like he's just been on a jolly. He's just got parrots and scarves and ribbons and everything. It's like he's just been off doing his gap year travelling rather than actually serving anything useful at all. Is that how the Navy were portrayed generally in this period? Or
Yes, the Navy were much loved before Battle of Trafalgar 1805, before the death of Nelson. They were much loved before that, in fighting the French in 1792. The Navy were always at war generally. You didn't see a sailor often apart from in the ports. You wouldn't see a sailor inland. You see yeomanry, militia, enlisted soldiers and cavalry inland, being bored, fighting in pubs, chasing women. Sailors were, of course, doing their fair share, so I gather, chasing women, but usually abroad. So the sailors coming ashore would often have a spree with their prize money. They put on their silver buckles, their best ribbons, their best doublets, their best hats, their best trousers, and go out. They used to hijack stagecoaches. You might get 20 sailors hijacking a stagecoach and ride from Southampton to London and just cause a riot in the streets. Very, very colourful. This carries on right through to the Second World War. I've worked in presentation in World War II Navy uniform. Everyone likes a sailor. They still do in this country, still like sailors. It's a rich maritime history. Sailors are also men of portrayed, I think usually are men of courage. They're resourceful. They get cannon up mountains to go to Spain and elsewhere. So sailors were very popular in that respect, but also I think it was generally known that they had a good time on their time off.
Right, so Bob Loveday is properly fitting the bill there.
That's right.
I think Trumpet Major is just kind of one of the jolliest Hardy novels you can find. And it is just a bit of a romp, falling right into all those stereotypes that you're expecting, but at the same time with Festus just doing something slightly different, undermining that really, really cruel, barbarous militia image of Peterloo, but actually kind of bringing in something that is humorous and allows you to laugh at them. So I think we've kind of gone over the Napoleon era, but what I'd like to go into now is looking at Far From Madding Crowd, which I understand, Nigel, you have actually read. But it's interesting with Far From Madding Crowd, it's set somewhere around 1840s to 1860s, as I understand it. And so we've got, in that, this really, really flashy military figure comes striding onto the stage. Admittedly, I think he's first seen in the dark, so you get this glittering of his brass buttons under candlelight and the kind of flash of scarlet of his tunic, and he's very much a kind of showy, impressive figure, and this is Sergeant Troy. But I thought it was quite interesting, Nigel's take on Sergeant Troy, because I just went, oh, he's got a military title, that's impressive. But so I was just wondering if you could outline the realities of Sergeant Troy.
He's just a sergeant, isn't he? I didn't know until I spoke to Tracy just now that he was the son of a lord, the legitimate son of a lord, the character. But he speaks very well for a sergeant in the army, but he's just a sergeant. He's wearing a slightly nicer tunic, the soldiers, otherwise it's the same sort of thing. He has a certain amount of command. So he hasn't served overseas. He's not fought in any battles. He comes across as more of a gentleman than most rank and file I've ever read about. He's well educated. He speaks well. I don't think Bathsheba would have been anywhere near as charmed by an ordinary member of the rank and file in the army had it not education. So he seems to have the flair of an officer, but he's only a sergeant, which I find quite interesting.
And I was talking to Harriet earlier, and Harriet was saying about how Sergeant Troy is just like Wickham out of Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice. And it's funny because you've just made me remember that the wonderful Hardy critic Richard Nemesvari, he actually compared the Trumpet Major to what he calls a Jane Austen novel run slightly out of control.
I love this image of, we've got Sergeant Troy coming in, and from memory, he kind of impresses the other characters that are there. I seem to remember them playing the Soldier's Joy at one of the dances, and there's that sense of almost, we must honour our soldiers. But actually that sense that he hasn't done anything worth celebrating. He hasn't seen any action. And I was thinking, Nigel, the number of conflicts we were involved with between 1840 and 1860.
Yeah, many. Imperial conflicts, apart from the Crimean War. We're in Afghanistan in 1842, we're in the Punjab in 45, 46, and 48, 49. We're in New Zealand in the 1840s, 1860s as well, fighting the Maoris. Yeah, lots of conflict.
So Sergeant Troy isn't going out to fight any of those, even though there seem to be plenty available that he could go out if he was actually a proper military man. But I was also thinking that's quite an interesting reflection on Hardy and his engagement with those kind of conflicts, that there would be plenty for him to have sent Sergeant Troy out to do, and that would have been quite an interesting link between Wessex and the wider world. And yet he doesn't seem to, I don't know, Tracy, if you have any more insight in this, but he doesn't seem to ever make any references to those conflicts.
No, he doesn't make any explicit references in Far From the Madding Crowd, you're right. And I think it's part of the way that he presents Troy as not being a military man so much as just a cad, really, who uses his uniform to get who and what he wants. Because, yeah, he was supposedly the illegitimate son of a lord and a French governess. So take from that what you will, and he does what he wants. And it's quite interesting, I think, that the thing we all remember him the most for is his sword play around Bathsheba. And we all think, oh, that's wonderful, how sexy, I'm blushing, blah, blah, blah. What we don't remember, and you would have thought, oh, that's manly, but it's a performance. He's performing something on purpose, and the sexual innuendos all the way through that scene are just something else. But then compare that to the scene where he's discovered Fanny has died with his unborn child. She's been buried. He thinks, oh, I've got to show my mourning here. She was what should have been my wife, all of that blather. And he plants all of these bulbs and pretty flowers that he knows nothing about right underneath a gargoyle spout. And of course it rains that night. Everything washes away, all his hard work, and he actually goes off in a huff like a little boy who's thrown his Legos out of the sandpit. And you don't see him again until towards the end of the book. So, yeah, again, an attack on masculinity as it was expected is my reading of Sergeant Troy.
And do you think that is, I know this is going to be a big question to ask, but do you think that's Hardy attacking these characters as representing a kind of martial masculinity specifically, or do you think it is generally a wry humour to all establishment and all characters that think something of themselves in all of his novels?
I think it's both, actually. The reason why I do think that it has something to do with sending up martial masculinity in particular is because there's yet another novel, A Laodicean, where he does it even more brilliantly. The bad guy, as it were, in A Laodicean, Will Dare, is actually androgynous, and he is the illegitimate son of Captain, not just Sergeant, Captain de Stancy, who is supposed to be this huge, upstanding member of not just the military, but the patriarchy. And as it turns out, it's Will who controls Captain de Stancy's life, not the other way around. He comes out with these speeches like, I have been preparing this for you for so long. This marriage is important and you're going to do it. This is an androgynous son talking to a captain of the military father. He's described with his massive set of whiskers and his voice and everything the stereotypical military patriarch was supposed to be. And yet he kowtows to his son and says, yes, Willie, no, Willie. So again, he's completely taking the mick. I mean, if it was just a once-off like Troy, you would say, oh, it's Hardy and his characters. But he does it 3 times in novels alone.
Now you've reminded me of that scene with Sergeant Troy and the sword and Shiver. Did men go around the countryside waving swords at young women?
No. I think there's an element here as well. Hardy, in his research on the wars, 1815 period, the militia were our defence, yeomanry as well. So they freed up many, if you like, real soldiers to go and fight abroad. So I think there was a mixed response at the time amongst the public towards militia and yeomanry, in that on one hand they are these sort of not quite heroes, but they're brave men stepping forward. Okay, they have to, but they're coming forward to do their bit should the French invade. And Wessex was under threat of invasion by Napoleon. So I think there's that. The other side of it, which I think Hardy seems to be referring to by undermining some of these military characters, is the buffoons who put in charge of other people, the incompetence of the soldiers, how the good soldiers who can at least look good with a sword stand out from the ordinary militia or yeomanry perhaps as well. So this two-way view of the militia at the time, I think.
It does feel very Dad's Army.
Oh yes, especially Festus.
One interesting thing I was just reflecting on that we said right at the very beginning is Hardy's own grandfather was a volunteer, and that's one thing I find slightly interesting is we've got this juglet Hardy owned which says success to the volunteers on one side and then a little caricature of John Bull fighting Napoleon on the other side, and that sense that Hardy has kept that as something that meant a lot to him, that it then is very much signalling that connection that Hardy had between the volunteers that we're then saying that he seems to be mocking the whole time. I think probably it's best to move on now to looking at how that seems to change with the Boer War, and we suddenly get Hardy giving a lot of sympathy to military characters. I'm guessing he's moving away from the volunteers. Quite often these are military characters who are actually disembarking and going to South Africa. But we have Drummer Hodge, which I think is a really interesting poem. I think, Nigel, you were saying that you've been comparing it to one of Rudyard Kipling's.
Yeah, well, Hodge, it's a very short poem. It's a clever poem, whereas Tommy by Kipling, written not long before 1890, telling a story from an ordinary soldier's point of view. So Tommy refers to a soldier as being very unpopular in pubs and theatres. When there's not a war, get to the back, get out, you're drunk and you're scum. When there's a war, if you go, you're heroes all. And he's saying we're not heroes all, we're just ordinary soldiers. We're here all the time. We're not all ruffians. We're just doing our job for very little money up to a very ungrateful public. The two compare in that respect, but Drummer Hodge, I quite liked it. I think it conveys the simplicity of being a drummer in the army. These were uneducated young men, and they're going out there to the other side of the world and dying and little thought of. So yeah, it's odd. The two do compare, but I think soldiers at the time, all the way through, right through to the Boer War and up to the First World War, were thought much less of than perhaps they should have been. Armies are not popular until something goes wrong. We see this comparison in more modern wars like Afghanistan, Iraq as well. When there's a war, suddenly it's, yes, go on, the Army, Navy, Air Force, go in there, get in there. The rest of the time they can be a bit of a bother, especially in the pubs in Colchester on Saturday night, be it in 1800 or in 2022.
That's a really interesting point, and I think that's one of the things that Hardy, I feel, says repeatedly through his poems, is emphasising that everydayness of the soldiers. There's another poem he writes called A Man He Killed, which is imagining just meeting in a pub with someone that he's just killed on the Boer War fields and saying, if we met in a pub, I would have just bought him a drink, we would have had a nice chat, I might have just lent him some money if he was going short, and we would have gotten on fine. And he probably just joined up because he was a bit short of cash, like I was, and now I've just shot him. And that kind of sense of normality of who soldiers are in their everyday life, which I think, like you're saying, kind of that sense of they're not just suddenly there on the battlefield as a military figure when we come to times of crisis. They are people who are existing in their everyday lives as well.
Yeah, but they're professional soldiers as well. So when they sign up, they know what they're getting into, or they think they do, at 18 years old or whatever. And many join for various reasons, including boredom, lack of jobs, boring jobs, and a sense of adventure. And until World War One, I think, barring the Crimea, away in the army was quite adventurous. Your chances of being in a fight were still fairly remote. World War One changed that, of course, because you've got industrial warfare and millions dying on these battlefields, industrial weapons. So World War One changed it a lot, I think, even from the Boer War.
Yeah, I found that interesting. When I was like, Hardy's friends have very diverging opinions on the Boer War. You've got George Bernard Shaw, who's really against it. Then you've got Rudyard Kipling, who is very pro it. And Hardy seems to be trying to walk this narrow line between them all, not offending anyone, but very much focusing on the individual tragedy of it. And himself too old to be enlisted by that point because he's 59. And so kind of almost seeing himself as a witness to this, and seeing it almost as a duty to go out and be there in person, witnessing when the troops are disembarking from Southampton. And then I think his opinion seems to change slightly from that when you go into World War One, and suddenly he becomes critical of what war has become as a more of a political thing, that sense of why are we declaring war on our neighbours? Why haven't we learned a better way of getting through this now? And there's a really hard-hitting poem it's called Christmas 1924. And to summarise it, it's 1,000 years of saying mass, we've got as far as poison gas. And Hardy in his old age just saying, why are we still at this point?
It's still with us, isn't it, that one, in a way? It's difficult. I struggle when I'm talking about World War One to the public. We've had years of Blackadder, Oh What a Lovely War, and the 60s revisionists of World War One. It seems in my research, most soldiers who went away to the war, 9 out of 10 came back, 3 out of 10 were wounded, 1 in 10 were killed. So 6 out of 10 came back without a scratch, physically anyway. But they seem to come back generally with a view of having done a very nasty job and put the Kaiser back in his box. Now, I think after the war, of course, especially as they get older, they reflect. As you said, about the story, meeting someone you killed in the pub, having a chat. You hear this on TV interviews with veterans from World War One and World War Two. I think back to one soldier they might have killed, looking through his eyes as they killed him. It comes later, doesn't it?
What I'd like to look at quickly here, again, Hardy isn't able to engage personally in this conflict, but he is having influence on people who are. So his books are being read by Siegfried Sassoon, who sees his novels as a kind of escapism. He writes and says, it's so lovely to basically be walking through Wessex while sitting in a trench. But you also he writes around this point this epic poem, The Dynasts, which is actually about the Napoleonic War, but it almost seems to create this model that some of the younger poets find that they can speak about their experiences of the First World War through, which I thought was quite interesting. But I was just wondering, what was Hardy's role here? Does he have any relevance, or is he just an old man sitting in a chair in Dorset while everything goes on around him?
I think it comes back to the poem afterwards. He was a man that used to notice such things. And what we need to remember is Drummer Hodge was just one of many, many poems he wrote about World War One. But the thing is, he always wrote them not necessarily from the soldier's point of view, more the people who were left behind or the gods who he saw as controlling everybody as puppets. And so you've got things like A Wife in London, which is tragic because she receives a letter from her husband saying, oh, we're going to do all of this when I get back, just as the man is knocking on the door to deliver the news that he's been killed in the war. There's the souls of the slain. There's the sick battle god. It's either the little man and the people left behind, or it's the gods. He doesn't write poetry as such about the officers and the sergeants and the commanders, because other people are doing that, I think. And he doesn't want to glorify any of it. And of course, the man he killed is still part of the AQA school anthology. And when I teach that next to Wilfred Owen's Exposure, because you're getting it from a normal person's point of view. With masculinity, the thing about World War One that changed a lot was men coming back seemingly unharmed, but psychologically extremely wounded. And before World War One, you had eminent Victorian doctors like Henry Maudsley spouting off that only women can become hysterical because only women have a womb, which is hystia in Latin. And he believed that a woman shouldn't try and educate herself because then her womb would atrophy from lack of use. And then what good is she? Whereas you had Sigmund Freud in 1870 saying, look, men get hysterical too. It took until World War One and shell shock and death and wounding on a massive scale for the establishment to finally realise this happens to everybody, not just women. And so Hardy specialises in the psychological condition. Oh, as well as complaining about horses being used in the Boer War and World War One. He was pretty against that as well.
Yeah, I was really surprised to find out about that and actually read about he wrote a letter supporting horses not being used in conflict. I think it was something like 2 months before the Boer War broke out. So this is going completely away from your amazing point about the psychological trauma and the idea of hysteria. I think that's a really interesting point. I don't know, Nigel, if you want to respond to any of that.
I've been more involved with the common soldiers' views, with World War One in particular, looking at the Webber's Times, Trench Magazine, albeit little snippets written, I think, mainly by officers, quite literate. The ordinary Tommy's way of dealing with it wasn't so much by writing down what he felt, often he was quite illiterate, but it was more by making a joke, singing a song, being superficial, keeping it superficial, maybe keeping a distance between himself and what's going on around him as well. So I think Owen and Sassoon are very, very relevant. They're officers, they're educated men. They weren't speaking for the rank and file, but they were speaking for the rank and file. So there's a bit of a conflict there between what the soldiers report about it. We have personal reminiscences, which are very important.
Speaking from experience rather than an armchair as well, very important.
Owen and Sassoon are very important. They're not writing in the way that ordinary Tommy would write, but they are telling the story of ordinary Tommy very well.
unfortunately, we're going to have to start wrapping up here, even though I'm sure there is so much more we could say on this subject. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And so I think, even though we've got some things where Hardy has lost out, I think we lost a point right at the very start with him having been completely put to the post by Rifleman Harris and other such accounts of the Napoleonic period. But I think we've said he actually is doing something quite novel with the way that he's overturning these ideas of martial masculinity throughout his novels. And then I think this really powerful point that Tracy brought in about the psychological depictions of the everyman and their experience of war, and not necessarily at the event either, but after the event, reflections on it, and the effect also on wives, families, and that which comes through in his kind of trying to empathize with the other people involved in conflict. And I think that's a really interesting point, and hopefully that gives Hardy a few more points so we can drag him back up onto the kind of bandwagon. I think it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. My final thought was his poem In Time of Breaking of Nations, which basically says, you know, no matter what conflicts come through, no matter what crises happen, there will still be someone getting on with life somewhere in the world. And that stoicism, which just says, you know, no matter how many conflicts we have, and we've talked about so many, hopefully somewhere still in the world, life will continue and life will keep on going. So thank you so much for joining me, and it's been an absolutely amazing episode.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Special thanks go out to our sponsors, Batten Solicitors, as well as our funders, Arts Council for England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Make sure to subscribe here if you want to catch future episodes.